Hey guys, John here from Sonic Drive Studio. I hope you're all doing well and welcome back to the channel. Today we're checking out the brand new Grit drum expansion from ML Drums by ML Sound Lab, and we're going to have a lot of fun with this one. First, let's go ahead and take a listen to a little demo that I created with these drums so you guys can hear how they sound in a full mix. Have fun and check it out. All right, so that sounded pretty awesome. So a little bit about this new pack. This pack was recorded in one of the most famous recording studios from Finland. I have a little bit of a cheat sheet going on here so I can give you all the juicy details. This was recorded at Finvox Studios with real top-of-the-line vintage hardware chains, starting with everything from real OG Neumann, Sennheiser AKG mics to Neve API Pultec EQs to UREI compressors. So this is the real deal when it comes to all the gear that was used to create these drum tones, okay? So the mics are really good, the preamps are really good, and all the outboard gear, all that analog goodness, basically. This expansion adds 10 kit pieces mainly based on Gretsch shells with a bell brass snare and Zildjian A custom cymbals. The band Blind Channel collaborated with ML Sound Lab on this project. Their latest song and upcoming album was recorded on this drum setup and is being mixed by Zach Cervini, not sure how to pronounce that. The first preset, Dead Zone, very closely matches that actual mix from the actual song. There's another preset made by Miko that's a more generic works in most mix scenarios type of preset. And the last preset is made for people who want a more raw multi-out sound, which is what I used for this particular demo. Now I must say that the raw sound of these drums already is really good, and they do fit in the mix even without processing. They sound really good, especially that snare, as you heard. I love that snare and the big fat kick. Overall, I really love these drums. But of course, I added some processing to make the sounds my own, which is what I love doing. It's basically what I love the most about mixing. Mixing drums is just a lot of fun, and you really get to sort of make them your own, make them your own signature drums. So that's what I like to do, and that's what I'm going to do today and show you guys how I achieved these tones. So first, what we're going to do in the DAW is take a listen to the isolated drums here for a second. So here is the ML Drums plugin with the new kit. So these are all the new kit pieces, the new cymbals, the new snare, the new toms, and the new kick. And as you can see, I used the unprocessed Grit kit. However, I did go into the mixer and do a little bit of tweaking here and there, but I'll show you that in a second. First, let's take a listen to the isolated drums for a second. So yeah, to my ears, that sounds really, really good. Very fat, very big, a very big and massive rock sound. And yeah, it's a great drum sound. I'm really impressed. Now what I'm also going to do is let you guys hear the drums without the processing. So I'm going to turn off all the plugins that I am using here for the drums. And as you can see, I've routed all the channels separately into the DAW, and the master fader on the mixer here is muted over here. So I'm just controlling all the separate channels. So I'm going to turn off all the processing, including the processing on the drum bus, and we're going to take another listen. So as you can hear, that already sounds really good. Sounds quite organic and big and fat. And yeah, as I said, they used all the top of the line gear, of course. And I think that they also did a little bit of processing on outboard gear to make them sound a little bit better from the get-go, which is great. Now let's take another quick listen to the drums with the processing on again. So you guys can hear that in reference to the dry drums. So yeah, dry they sound fine, and processed they sound even better, and they fit the mix really well, and they sound very professional, organic, punchy, and massive, and I love it. So as I said, I did a couple of things in the plugin itself. As you can see here in the mixer, what I did basically was I cranked the room for the snare. So this sends the snare to the room. So when you do this, you basically get more snare in the room. So I like that because I like my snares to have a big roomy sound, which helps for the sustain. And I also increased the reverb for the snare here as well as for the toms, okay? I left the EQ and the compression and the saturation completely alone. So I just messed a little bit with those levels. So sending the single drum tracks to the room or to the reverb. I also increased the reverb length a little bit just to make it a little bit longer. And I also dialed down the overheads in the room track because I prefer to have the shells be more prominent in the room than the overheads. I rather leave the cymbals and stuff primarily to the overhead mics. So that's all that I did in the plugin itself. I also enabled the human function, which is making it sound a little bit more human. What it basically does is it brings in some variations in the hits and the velocities and stuff like that to make it sound a little bit less robotic. It's a great feature indeed. I love that. And what I also did in the DAW to sort of double that humanization down a little bit is I added a MIDI insert here, and I used the MIDI modifier over here. And you can use that to humanize the drums even further. And for the targets, I choose the position. So this is kind of, where the MIDI notes are placed. And it randomizes that. And I put the maximum value at 6 and the minimum value at -1. So basically, most of the notes will be slightly delayed to some extent in a random manner. And I did the same for the velocity. So the maximum value is set to 2, and the minimum value is set to -7. So there will be some hits there that go down a little bit in the velocity. And this helps to also make it sound a little bit more human. You don't have to do this, but I like to do it. And of course, you can do this for any instrument in Cubase, so that's great. And just to show you guys how I programmed the drums, I used the standard GM MIDI map over here. It's a very easy MIDI map to use. And yeah, these are all the notes. I programmed everything by hand, which is how I always like to do things. And of course, for the snare, there are various velocities happening, ghost notes and stuff like that. And also for the hi-hats to make it sound a bit more human and as if it's played by a human. So that's great as well. And of course, in case you're curious, let's also take a very quick look at the guitars and see how they sound in solo, because I know you guys like guitar tones, right? Great. So that's also an ML Sound Lab plugin. It's the Amped Fluff 2C plugin. As you can see, everything's stock. I tweaked the settings, of course. I also tweaked the cab settings a little bit. And that's the guitar tone. And in terms of processing, I also did a little bit of that here. Cut out some mids and cut some lows, and also have a high cut going on at 11K or so. So yeah, very simple, but a great guitar tone. I used my ESP LTD Iron Cross, James Hetfield signature, so it does kind of have that Metallica tone, obviously, but it's a bit more kind of nu metal-ish, so it was a fun song to work on. All right, back to the drums, and let's start with the kick drum, and let's take a listen to the kick drum in solo. That's a great sounding kick, very massive, I love it. So on all my tracks, what I basically always do is I add the virtual tape machines by Slate Digital, and then in the virtual mix rack, which is my main sort of channel strip plugin, I also always load up the virtual channel. So this makes it sound as if everything is recorded on tape and through an analog mixing console. Now these drums already were recorded through an analog chain, so you don't need to do this, but it doesn't hurt to sort of do it over again with these plugins. It makes everything sound a little bit more analog and warm. So what I'm basically doing here is two things. I'm adding a little bit of EQ with this SSL EQ over here, cutting some upper mids and cutting some lower mids, and also boosting some very deep low end around 50 hertz or so. And let's take a listen to what that's doing for the kick drum. So as you can hear, when I bypass that plugin, the kick drum is a bit more boxy sounding. Now for more vintage drums, that's all fine. But for a more modern kick drum sound, I like to cut those mids. You know, it makes the kick have more impact and punch. And it also leaves more room for the guitars and such. So that's great. And I also think that this SSL plugin, or the FGS by Slate, is just a great plugin for that. Until we see ML Sound Lab mixing plugins, of course. That should be fun. Hopefully that happens in the future. Okay, and then my secret weapon, my not-so-secret weapon, the Monster, also by Slate, of course, which is based on an all-buttons-in 1176 compressor, and it's just a very extreme compressor, and I always use that in parallel to make things sound bigger. So I used the big kick preset over here, and I dialed in the mix a little bit. It's making the kick drum sound a bit more fat. Take a listen. So it brings in a little bit more sustain, and it brings it forward a little bit. And then I compensated the level with the trimmer over here. Let's do a quick A/B of the kick drum without the EQ in the compressor and the kick drum with. So that's without and with. Wonderful. Love that kick drum. Let's move on to the snare. All right, so in the EQ over here, I removed this mid frequency, which was a little bit annoying to my ears. Let's take a listen. In solo, it might not bother you that much, but in the mix, it was bugging me a little bit. So let's take a listen in the mix. It just cleans it up a little bit, and I like that. Okay, again, the virtual tape machine and the virtual mix rack with the same virtual channel setting and everything. Okay, so in terms of processing, not a lot happening here, but plenty to get the juices going. So we're starting off the chain with the Hollywood virtual tube collection for saturation. So that's making the snare drum nice and fat. What I'll do now is I'll turn everything off aside from the virtual channel and the trimmer, and then I'll start turning everything on so you can hear how it all adds up. So first, let's take a listen to the snare without those modules on. So that's a nice sounding snare. Now keep in mind that a lot of the snare sound doesn't just come from the close mic, it also comes from the room mics and the reverb, but we'll get to that in a second. So what happens when we add the saturation? Let's take a listen. So it makes it a bit more fat and round sounding, which is wonderful. I love that on a snare. And I compensated the added output a little bit with the output control over here. Then for the EQ, I'm cutting some mids. That's a theme that I have going a lot in my drums. I like cutting mids because that leaves room for the guitars and other instruments, okay? And also by removing mids on the drums, you do make them more powerful and punchy. And I'm also adding in a little bit of low mids or low end on the snare as well. So let's take a listen to what that's doing. And that's going to be especially apparent when I add the compressor. So we'll do that in a second. But first, let's take a listen to this lift EQ that I added to add some top end and some bottom end as well, just to give it a little bit more of that smiley face sound. Let's take a listen. So some punch and clarity there. And then again, of course, the monster on the snare slammer preset, but again with the mix knob tweaked a little bit. I think I raised it here. Let's take a listen. I love what that is doing. And now an AB with all the processing off aside from the virtual console. Let's take a listen. And with processing on. So that's a great snare. Again, let's do a quick check with the EQ off and the compressor on so you guys can really hear the difference a little bit better. So it's a little bit boxy sounding, a little bit mid-rangey, and then when we add the EQ, it cuts better and it's less boxy. Wonderful snare sound. For the toms, I'm also not doing a whole lot over here. Let's go ahead and take a look. And let's move to this tom section over here. So there's a little bit of a dip going on here in the upper mid-range. There was a little bit of a clickiness in the toms that I didn't really enjoy, so I took that out. Let me exaggerate that for you. So I'm taking some of that out. They're clicky enough for my taste. And then in the virtual mix rack, again, some saturation. Let me turn off everything once again and take a listen. So again, the Hollywood Saturator Virtual Tube Collection is making it sound more round and more warm. And then with the EQ over here, I'm cutting some mid-range again, some boxy mids. So that's making them sound a bit more open with more punch. And then this FG401 compressor. And this compressor is acting a little bit differently than the Monster. This isn't adding a lot of sustain per se. This is making them sound a little bit more punchy so that they cut through a little bit better in the mix. Let's A/B this entire chain. So again, more impact, less mids, and thicker sounding. On the hi-hat, I'm almost doing nothing. Because obviously a lot of the hi-hat is also coming through the overhead mics, but I'm cutting a lot of lows and mids over here and also cutting some low mids. You don't need all that swooshy and washy mid-range in a hi-hat, at least not in my opinion. So I took that out and I raised the level as well because I wanted more hi-hat. There's no ride in this song. This grit pack does not have a ride, but of course you can use the other ride that comes in ML drums. And now the overheads. Let's take a quick listen. Okay, so in the channel strip EQ, I'm cutting some resonant frequencies that I didn't really enjoy myself. Those types of mid frequencies, they can interfere a little bit with the guitars and stuff. So I preferred cutting those out. And then in the virtual mix rack, there is some stuff going on. Of course, the virtual channel again. And then this Neve EQ to cut a lot of low mids. And then the SSL EQ to cut even more mids and cut some lows under about 300 hertz. Let's take a listen to what those two are doing. So as you can hear, those are sucking out a lot of those boxy mids that we just don't need in a modern mix like this. Again, this helps to give the drums more impact and more punch and more clarity as well, and it makes the mix less foggy. Then I've got a compressor over here with this overheads preset, and it's smoothing out the transients a little bit. And then again, the monster. And this brings all the overheads a bit more forward and makes it all sound a bit more washy in a very nice way. Let's A/B those for a second. The red one, so the FG401, is very subtle, and all that that's doing basically is taking care of the snare transients. And then the entire strip along with the EQ. I mean, the overheads do sound great without the processing, but this was just to make them work in the mix, which is what this is all about. And then the room, let's take a listen. Let's add in the snare for a second. That is one nice sounding room channel. Love it. So again, what I did in ML Drums is I sent the snare track to the room louder. So there's more snare in the room that there would be naturally, but it makes the snare sound much bigger, and I like that. So, and again, I also took out some overheads, by the way, in that channel. So what am I doing here? I'm adding some EQ again, cutting some mids, some boxy mids, and I'm using this FG116 compressor to smash the drums. Let's A/B the EQ first. So again, cutting out that mid-range makes it sound more clear. And yeah, it sounds much better that way. And then the compressor. So that's really smashing the drums, especially the snare. So it's really ducking those snare transients down. And then it makes the snare more fat and it gives the snare more sustain in the room, which is wonderful. Really cool. And then the final channel, the reverb channel. Let's take a quick listen. So I'm boosting a little bit of 600-ish hertz to make the reverb stand out in the mix a little bit more. It's subtle, but you can take a listen. So that's kind of an area in the frequency range where the guitars aren't really very prominent and the drums as well. So by boosting that frequency in the reverb, you're going to hear the reverb a little bit more in the mix. Let's try that for a second. So I can hear a difference, but it's subtle. Not everything that you do has to be very extreme. Okay. So yeah, that's the processing, basically. I also added an FG116, the black one, to sort of smash the reverb a little bit. And I've also cranked the output a little bit, just to get more reverb on those drums. Let's take another quick listen to the entire kit with all the processing. That sounds so good, especially the kick and snare. Absolutely love that. Now to finish this off, of course, I'm sending all the drums, all the single drums to a drum group, and I'm doing a little bit of processing there as well. Of course, again, the monster on the drum exciter preset tweaked the level or the mix a little bit. Let's see what that's doing. So yeah, that definitely makes the drums sound more exciting. It brings them forward and adds even more sustain, which is always good. And then just sort of even the drums out a little bit. I'm also using the FG Gray over here. To even out the dynamics. And this also sort of livens up the transients ever so slightly, which is cool. So let's do a quick A/B. So that's adding some nice analog juice, if you will. So yeah, that's the drum mix. I really enjoyed working with these new ML Drums grit samples. They sound absolutely awesome, and I'm having so much fun. And I hope that these tips, or at least showing you the processing that I did on the drums, will help you guys out creating your own big fat drums. Now, what really helps is the fact that these drums already sound so good out of the box. So you're not going to have to deal with a lot of annoying frequencies or stuff like that. You don't have to make very drastic EQ moves with a lot of peaks and stuff to make these work. They just work straight away. And all of this stuff is just to make them sound how you want them to sound and to make them your own. Okay. And of course, you can also do a lot of these processing things that I'm doing in the plugin itself. Because as you may or may not know, in the mixer, you can add compression, saturation, tweak the EQ, and stuff like that. So thanks to ML Sound Lab for sponsoring this video. I really appreciate it. Great job on these drums. And I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Let me know in the comments down below your thoughts on these drums. And if you want to pick them up yourself, these expansions from ML Sound Lab are always very, very affordable. So I recommend checking them out for sure, as well as the free version for ML Drums. If you enjoyed this video, also please drop a like and subscribe down below, as that really helps the channel out. And you can also follow Sonic Drive Studio on Facebook and Instagram. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I hope to see you soon. Cheers!